So, folks, we're being told that the number one goal of this presidency, this administration, and indeed all of humanity is to compete with China in a fake arms race, to go into trillions of dollars of private debt, but really buttressed by government public debt, printing money to juice up the stock market, which means juicing up the Mag 7 AI companies and building massive data centers, gobbling up land, farmland, wetlands, um, building these data centers that will suck up all the power and water and alter the character of rural America, which is really Trump's base, all for the purpose of creating this godlike AGI, generative AI, that's going to put all of our lives on the cloud through querying of information, basically handicap us from ever learning in the normal method. And then somehow you spin that in a centrifuge, you throw it up against the wall, and out will pop super intelligence that could answer anything you want and solve any problem and do anything. This is literally what people like Sam Altman have been talking about the last couple of years, and it's reached a feverish pitch this year with its one-upped partnership with the government, even over last administration. And obviously, I have been doing my best to bring this to life and warn people that this is not a drill. All of you who are appalled by warp speed, well, this is warp speed 2.0, but with a magnitude of 100 in terms of its deleterious consequences, the cognitive consequences, the social, human development consequences, and then just the hardware, the land, the power, and then obviously the misallocation of resources. I've said a number of times, I'm not against technology. I'm not against efficiencies. I'm not against AI. It is what it is. It's a matter of the government is bypassing the natural free market to misallocate investments to this big promise of, super intelligence, all through massive amounts of data collected. Isn't that convenient, by the way? Somehow the very things that are needed to create a surveillance state is somehow needed to beat China, but then we're selling them the H200 chips. So what's going on here? Well, I'm new to the game, but there is someone from day one that was warning about this even before GPT was put out on the market for the last 300 years. Gary Marcus, who's an NYU professor emeritus of neurosciences. He's a cognitive, science expert, author of 6 books, including, you got to get these 2 books in particular relevant to today's discussion: Rebooting AI and Taming Silicon Valley, at Gary Marcus on Twitter. And Marcus on AI Substack is truly informative and entertaining. And he's finally with us. It's taken me all year to get him. But Gary, welcome to the Blaze for the first time.
Thanks. That was a great introduction, and you put your finger on it. There's a lot of magical thinking going on, and it's causing government to do all kinds of crazy things.
So I want to start. This is so vast, and we're not going to get to everything today. We're going to have you back. But I want to start off with the sort of data center pursuit of cloud-based AGI, this AGI deity. The New Yorker did an interesting, semi-profile on you, as people like me finally caught on, because you can't miss the fintech side of this, the bubble side. In the aftermath of GPT-5's launch, the views of critics like Marcus seem increasingly moderate. Obviously, you've been predicting this for a long time. Could you first explain the other side's thesis of collecting massive amounts of data derived from human behavior and then substituting it for intelligence? What is their thesis, and why did you know it was wrong?
So the thesis they sometimes call scaling is all you need. And the idea behind scaling is we would just add more and more data, more and more GPUs or TPUs, more and more compute, more chips, and that somehow, basically magically, artificial intelligence would come out of it. And I've been looking at these kinds of models, we call them neural networks, since my dissertation. I think you said I was 300 years old. That's not really true. But I am, I've been around for a while. I got my PhD when I was 23, 30 some years ago, and my PhD was actually on these kinds of neural networks, kind of ancestors to today's. And my first book, which you didn't mention, The Algebraic Mind, looked
Mm.
at the ancestors to these things and actually excuse me, predicted that we would have things like hallucinations from these systems. I said, in fact, that it was inherent and inevitable that we would get overgeneralizations, which is really what hallucinations are. And I pointed out problems in reasoning and so forth. And so when these things came back on the scene in some form in 2012, it was immediately obvious to me we were going to have problems in reasoning and so forth. And I actually wrote an article in the New Yorker about that, problems with abstraction. Then large language models represented a further advance, but still basically had the same problem. So the fantasy is you're just going to get so much data that you can basically look everything up. And the reality is there's always new things. You can't just look things up. Even if you've seen, you know, everything on the internet, there will still be new things. There'll be new political circumstances, new economic circumstances, and so forth. And these systems don't really have deep concepts. They're really, at the end of the day, superficial. And so when scaling became a big thing, there was an article in 2020 from OpenAI. And I didn't take it too seriously at first, but eventually I saw that other people were taking it seriously. And so in 2022, I wrote an article that basically got me excommunicated from the machine learning community, called Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall. And the central thesis of that paper was that even if you added more data, you were still going to have these problems like hallucinations, reasoning problems, factuality, or not really getting factuality, and so forth. And they really hated me for it. I mean, Elon Musk took a crack at me. 35 million people read it. Sam Altman took a crack at me. Jan LeCun, who was then Facebook's chief AI officer, took a crack at me, and so forth. They were really pissed and they were really confident in themselves. They were sure that if we just poured more data and compute in, that would solve the problem. And they certainly put their money where their mouth is, right? They spent, between them close to $1 trillion on infrastructure and so forth. But the reality is it hasn't worked as well as they expected. So what they were promising, sometimes by hinting, sometimes explicitly, was artificial general intelligence, the kind of AI that could basically do anything a person could do, be just as flexible, just as good at generalization, just as good at taking on something new and handling it. That's what they kept hinting at. And I think the world actually believed these guys. That's why the world put so much money into it. I think the governments believed these guys. And I think people acted on that belief. They were terrified, for example, that China might get to GPT-5 before we did. And we can come back to the China side of it in a moment. So everybody thought GPT-5 is going to be AGI or close to it, artificial general intelligence with the power of humans. And then it actually came in August. And it was disappointing, as I had warned over and over and over again. You can look at an essay in my Substack called What to Expect When You're Expecting GPT-4. And it said, GPT-4 is going to blow people's minds. But when we look at it carefully, it's going to have all these problems. Well, it turns out GPT-5 still had all of the problems that I pointed out for GPT-4. That was an essay I wrote in December of 2022, Christmas Day, a month after
Mm.
ChatGPT had been released. So it's now been 3 years, and these core problems have not been solved. And people kept brushing them off. They'd be like, well, we'll solve hallucinations in a few months. Reid Hoffman said he'd bet any amount of money that was the case. This was a couple of years ago. I said, how about me? $100,000. He didn't respond. So as far as I'm concerned,
And by the way, to your point about hallucinations, I just read an article from a Virginia librarian that 15% of the inquiries they get for sources and journals from people are from hallucinated sources that don't exist. That's
wow.
how much the slop is flooding the zone.
I had not seen that statistic. That's an amazing statistic. And it's obviously a continued problem. There's a person who tracks every law case where the lawyer gets busted for using hallucinated cases. And last I looked, it had been like it went from 300 in May to like 600 in October. It's probably 1,000 by now. Many lawyers use this thing just as one example. And they put in hallucinated cases, right? I mean, the whole thing in a legal brief is you point to case law from previous cases, and these systems make them up left, right, and center. They make up biographical details. When I was on 60 Minutes a few years ago, they had to have a network memo about how to say this on broadcast TV. I called these things authoritative bullshit, which got bleeped. Um, and
That's what it is. It sounds so impressive at the first look.
Exactly, and that's part of the problem is it sounds so impressive. It is written in this authoritative style, most of the output. It sounds like an encyclopedia because they trained on a lot of encyclopedias and maybe for some other reason. And so it seduces people, and it will even say like crazy shit, like one that the New York City used, or sorry, no, this was a thing from Meta. Meta got asked what schools are good in New York City, and it gives an answer. And part of the answer is I send my kids to, I don't know, Bronx Science. It's like, you're a chatbot. You don't have kids. You didn't send anything anyone to Bronx Science, but it will say that authoritatively, like factually. I sent my kids to Bronx Science and whatever. They had a great time, but the gym classes weren't good or whatever. I'm just making up the details. I don't remember. But this happens all the time, that they would just make stuff up. And I just said, blah, 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 but I don't remember. I don't have the details. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say, I'm sure of this, I'm not sure of that. It delivers everything with complete confidence. And if you're not an expert on this stuff, you can get fooled.
I don't want to drag in another topic here, but it's just a little bit relevant. There's debate over American workers versus certain foreign workers, and that people are saying they're very impressive, and I once did a show on this, that there's a certain emotional social intelligence that American workers have, compared to others that might be a little bit more robotic, but certainly against robots itself and AI itself. Aren't we forgetting personality? Okay, that there is intelligence in that. For example, in my business, so the news business, I could certainly use a lot of aggregation. And I've got to tell you, maybe I don't know how to use these things, and that could be true, but I do not find them helpful in my line of work because I know how to write. If you're a ninth grader that struggles with every sentence, so
I
yeah,
have
it
a
will.
I have a famous line about that.
Yeah, it will
I
give
got
you some prose, but if you don't need the prose, I want, how many transgender attacks were there, or whatever, here or there, and I'll find it will miss basic things like that. And then the work I do, it's like I'm conservative, but I'm nuanced because I'm not a fan of the Republican Party. I'm not a Trump person, so my delivery is like you can't copy that. I don't find it useful. It almost seems like it's giving this, to quote Palantir CEO Karp, a neurally divergent sort of vibe to it.
I mean, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that it's mediocre and inaccurate. I got in a fight with Sam Altman on Twitter once, and I wrote this long, careful reply, and someone tried to insult me, and they said, "Did you use ChatGPT to write this?" And I said, "I don't pay for sex, and I don't write with ChatGPT." I personally don't like what it writes. Part of my career is as a writer. My Substack has almost
Yep.
100,000 subscribers, and I've written for the Times and the New Yorker and so forth. And I would be embarrassed to turn in a draft from ChatGPT. Like, I understand, like, for example, for non-native speakers,
Yep.
it can be of value. Like, there are uh, use cases for which it does make sense. But as someone who is partly a professional writer, for me, it would be a mess. The value in my writing is being funny, being clever, and having up-to-date facts and good arguments. And when you use ChatGPT to do an impression of me, there's lots of data out there, so it can do an impression of me. It will get the high-level arguments, but it won't get any of the detail, won't get any of the nuance, won't get
The
any of the humor. So
personality.
it won't get any of the personality to give you, a bland summary without giving you the arguments. And as an intellectual, I was a professor for 30 years before I retired young. The arguments matter to me, and it won't get the arguments right. Someone sent me a critique of me recently, and it was full of what we call straw man, misrepresenting what my arguments are. So we get the high level abstraction that a lame person on Twitter would get, and not get what I'd actually said, not get the nuance of the argument. And of course, the nuance matters for most things. I mean, you said that yourself in your own line of work. The nuance is often what really makes a difference, and it's not very good at nuance.
No, no, it definitely isn't. So this is my question. I don't understand. How is it that you saw this from day one, yet there's still, I'm a strong believer in markets and efficiencies of markets. How is the capital still chasing something that is a greater build out than highways and railroads, yet the outcome of it is so speculative and increasingly elusive. How does this keep going on? Where is the venture capital coming from?
I mean, I don't know where the money's coming from in some sense. But I think I see why venture capitalists are enthusiastic, even though on technical side, this doesn't make sense. So let me sort of unpack both parts of that. So on the technical side, the nature of these systems is that they take lots of bits of information, explode it into little bits, and reconstitute it. And they lose track of the connections between those bits. And that's why hallucinations are inevitable. We could dive deeper into that, but that's a good, summary. And knowing that much and having played with these systems, even their predecessors back in the day in the 1990s, it's very clear to me that that's how that works and that's what their limitations are. I, tried to shout this on the rooftops. They didn't want to hear it. They did not want to hear it, and I think that that's an important part of it. Why did they not want to? Because the scaling hypothesis is what venture capitalists love, right? On the one hand, they know how to, quote, scale a business, and they're thinking of this as scaling business. The other hand, they get paid as a cut of the money that they invest and how much they profit by. But notice, if they invest enough money on somebody else's behalf and it doesn't work out, doesn't matter because they've made 2% of a very large sum of money. So the perfect thing for a venture capitalist is a somewhat speculative thing that is massive, truly massive. And then they get 2% up front. So if you invest $1 million in a startup that has a new idea, that 2% really doesn't do you a lot of good. That's not going to pay your bills. But if you invest $1 billion, that 2% is already real money, right? And if it pans out, you make a lot. But even if it doesn't pan out, you're making your $20 million a year. That's fantastic, right? You do that for a couple of years, you've made $40 million. And so, you can be gone. You can have left town, by the time that everything falls apart. It's not your problem. And so venture capitalists love this scaling theory. It gives them a reason to take 2% of a really large sum of money. If the investment doesn't work out, it's not entirely their problem. And so they put in a lot of money, and that led to a kind of flywheel effect where companies like OpenAI were extremely well resourced. And so, of course, they got some results. The problem that they don't understand is that exponentials don't always continue indefinitely. So Moore's law was like that, kept getting these doublings, and then they slowed down. And I warned that that was going to happen here. In my famous 2022 paper that everybody hated, Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall, I said these things are not laws of the universe. I saw an interview where Altman implied that they were like quantum mechanics. They're not. And in fact, they're tailing off. So we've reached a period called diminishing returns. And many people are calling
Yep.
diminishing returns.
And and
I,
and and diminishing but depreciating. So as part of this,
depreciation is the
aren't a
second thing.
lot of isn't a lot of the hardware
Yeah, let's
as
get to
they
that in 1
wait.
second. Let's get
Yeah.
to that 1 second. So we reached the point of diminishing returns. So it's not going to work out. And
Mm.
it's not going to work out economically. I'll get back to depreciation in a second. It's not going to work out economically because what they had to do was to keep adding more and more hardware. This will set up the other point. They having to add more and more hardware. And at first, adding a little bit of hardware got big returns, in part because they also had to add data. And in the beginning, they were using, let's say, I don't know the real numbers, but 1% of the internet. And then they doubled that to 2%, and they got much better results. They doubled it to 4%. They got much better results. They doubled it to 8%. They're like, I know, you just double these things, right? But then they started using the entire internet and they didn't really get much better results. And you can't, now they have to do things like make up synthetic data because they've used all the natural data. So even still, the systems aren't reliable. So they had to spend much more resources, kept doubling or even more than doubling how much money they had to put in it. And for a while that paid off and they got better results. But even when they got really good results, the systems still aren't reliable. So now, instead of spending like $10,000 to train a neural network like somebody might have in 2012, people are spending maybe $1 billion to train a neural network. And the results aren't good enough to make the money back. So the whole field, not counting Nvidia, which is selling shovels in a gold rush, has maybe made $30 billion of profits. $30 billion is a lot of money, but they've invested $1 trillion. And so $30 billion ain't, well, I won't say it the way I was going to say.
And they're
30,
telling us they need like 6-7 trillion of
and they're telling
investment.
us they need 6 or 7 trillion. Or as my kids would say, 6-7 trillion. You clearly don't have kids, or you would have understood that was funny. Anyway, so
I got 4 of them, but they're
they're older.
yeah, they're much older.
So, if you invest $1 trillion and you make a return of $30 billion, that sucks, right? It's not sustainable. And in fact, one of the turning points, and then I will get to your depreciation. There's been 2 turning points this year that really changed the outlook. One is GPT-5 was disappointing, which I called, but almost nobody else did. And everybody was shocked by it because Sam Altman had sold them such a fantasy story. This goes back to the kind of magical thinking that you talked about in the beginning. So there was that. There was this, failure to meet
MIT study
expectations.
also.
And then say again?
The MIT study.
Well, yeah, okay. So and then there was the MIT study showing most companies aren't getting return on investment. And then I just lost the third one. Oh, and then there was this conversation that Altman had with Brad Gerstner that I think really shook a lot of people up.
Yeah.
So Altman goes on a show with Gerstner, who's a shareholder in his company and who's sympathetic, and he's just trying to like give him not a softball question, but like help explain to the, not a
how this is solvent.
How this is solvent was the question. He said, so let me get this straight. You have about 12, $13 billion in revenue, and you have and mind you, that's not profits. He's never made a profit. And so like it was a softer version of the question than it could have been. He could have said, you have never made a profit. At best, you mean $12 billion of revenue, but you're burning $3 billion a month. And you've just taken on over $1 trillion in commitments, stuff from Oracle and NVIDIA. How are you going to make ends meet? But he asked it in the most gentle way, not the sort of more aggressive way that I just imagined he could have, right? It was the easiest, softest version of his question, but it was a question that had to be asked, right? And so his buddy asked it to give him an opportunity to answer. And Altman, and everybody saw this, like either on YouTube or whatever, or live. Altman comes back with, well, actually, we're making more money than that, which couldn't document, didn't point to any documentation of it then or after, as far as I know. And he said, and if you don't like it, you can sell your shares. A lot of people would like to buy your shares, which everybody read as incredibly defensive and not a real answer. Yep. So you've had all those turning points. So what happened is NVIDIA dropped about 15% over the month since that happened, or the month in which it happened. Oracle dropped a bunch. CoreWeave dropped a bunch. These are indices of how the market is reflecting on this. And so, if you plot NVIDIA, it went up like a rocket and then it stalled. And it stalled, sometime between when GPT-5 was disappointing and that terrible interview that Altman gave with Gerstner and with the productivity. So the mood has really changed. In fact, this morning I was reading something from Ed Zitrone that somebody just texted me minutes before we went on. And Zitrone says, how did this even happen? Gary Marcus warned you in 2022. And then in parentheses, he puts, Gary Marcus was right, exclamation point, about the point that this stuff was not going to work. And that's your question, is like, if it was in plain view all along that this was not going to work, how did we get so crazy about it? And so the two answers are the venture capital loves it, which I gave you, and hype.
Government
and media. Well, we'll get to government in a minute, and I still want to get the depreciation point. But the media love this story. The media always loves stories about the world's going to change. It's going to be magic. Altman is a master manipulator, sold that story well. And so you had the hype, you had the venture capitalists. People wanted to believe it for different reasons. And that's how we got here. Then I'm going to just throw in the depreciation point, then we can get to some other stuff. All of this is worse for the following reason. Most of the money going into data centers, or I don't know what fraction, but some big fraction of it. There again, I'm modulating what I don't know in a way that ChatGPT would not. Most of the money that's going in is going to chips. Some of it is going to construction, buildings, and buying land and stuff. But mostly it's going to chips. What do we know about chips from the last 30, 40 years? They lose value very rapidly, right? Because they get replaced. It's a competitive market. People build better chips. So, chips from 1980 are worth zero, except as collector's items to, put on your your desk or something like that, right? Chips from 5 years ago aren't even worth that much. Apple comes up with a better phone every 2 years with a better chip, right? And so chips are a terrible investment. I mean, they're like at the level of like cars. Like, you don't usually invest in a car. You buy a car, but
Yeah.
you know that when you drive it off the lot, it's not going to be worth as much. When you buy one of these chips, you can guarantee that in 2 years it's not going to be worth anything like what you paid for it.
Or like when they compare it to building highways and railroads, the tracks don't disintegrate after 3 years.
That's right. I mean, there's been a lot of analogies to the infrastructure that the train companies make. I mean, tracks need repairs and stuff like that. But by and large, you build the track and, you do some maintenance on it. These chips in 5 years that we're spending $1 trillion on or whatever, they're not going to be worth that much because they're in better chips. And we haven't gotten to the whole, China thing yet. But, China is competing to make better chips. There will be better chips in 5 years. I guarantee it. And then, like, will people even want these chips that we put at these data centers? No, we're going to have to buy new chips. So you add in that depreciation, and this whole thing, which seemed insane to begin with, seems like completely insane.
So this is a good place to pick it up from because they're clearly at a crossroads. They're in trouble. Everyone knows it. The entire fintech media is talking about it. This is not
Both
just Gary.
NVIDIA and OpenAI. When you said they're in trouble, they're both in different kinds of trouble, by the way.
Yeah, and Oracle too. I mean, again,
Yeah.
they're a lot of debt. Oracle has a lot of debt, a lot of obligations for things that haven't even been built. So this is not just you saying this anymore. This has become very, very mainstream. So now they need help. So Trump comes in with this proposed ban on state regulations of data centers of the chatbots themselves. That Florida is, just announced an AI Bill of Rights with that, both on the data center side and on the AI use and functionality side. So their number one argument, and this is how they're getting a lot of conservatives who were otherwise suspicious of big tech and these companies, and they're saying, we got to be China. The New Manhattan Project, got to be China, got to be China. And then that sort of shuts down the debate. Could you shed light on what China actually is and isn't doing and competing with, and contrast their investments versus ours?
So I don't know every detail of their investments, and I want to rewind before I get to the question, just to make sure
Sure.
everybody understands what's at stake here. So the United States has almost no regulation around AI. China actually has a fair amount of regulation on AI, some of which I support, some of which I don't. So um, in general, they're kind of watching out for the citizens, but they're also watching their citizens. And they insist that things kind of toe the party line in a way that I hope will never happen in the United States. So that, I don't agree with all of it, but they do have regulation there that's fairly active and they've been working. Okay. I don't know the nature of their investments. A lot of that is opaque and certainly opaque to me. Um, Here's what I think, or sorry, and fill in one other thing. So to spell out what you just said, Trump, it looks like, is going to put through an executive order saying that only the federal government in the US can regulate China, not individual states. And a lot of states are freaked out about that. A lot of states are like, well, the federal government isn't actually doing anything. It'd be fine if you had one national policy that made sense and we can all abide by it. We do that sometimes. But we also have states' rights in the United States and have so for a long time. Conservatives have often championed those states' rights. They want their states to be able to do something different with respect to school prayer or whatever. Um, and what Trump's saying is no states' rights here. And people like Governor DeSantis are pretty upset about that. Newsom is too. Like, you have the left and the right.
Yep.
They both want to be able to make their citizens safe for AI. And
And then also the data center build out. I mean, this has become a big electoral issue.
And yeah, let's come to the data center build out in a second. But yeah, sure. So like states might want to have regulation like where you can put a data center, and there's power that goes along with it. And so you have citizens, there's starting to be a backlash. It's starting to be a really hot button issue. And it almost seems to me like the Trump administration is tone deaf to all of
Yep.
this. So they're ignoring what a lot of conservatives are saying. Of course, they're ignoring what the left is saying. And so they have this very, let's say, unique position that we should have a federal government that does nothing for the citizens, and we should not allow the states to step in. And so whether you're worried about data centers or you're on the left and you're worried about non-consensual deepfake porn, or maybe you're on the right and care about non-consensual deepfake porn, or whether you care about power centers, and do you want nuclear in your backyard, and do you get any say in it? Any of this kind of stuff. Trump is basically saying, tough, just you're going to have this stuff, you're going to have crammed down your throat. Meanwhile, people are seeing that maybe it's not really going to make money, and maybe it's actually going to blow up the economy. Maybe there's going to be a bailout. Like, why are you all in on this stuff? And I think Trump is putting himself in a box. And I've seen a bunch of articles about this, about how the conservative movements are splitting around it. MAGA is splitting around this. To me, it does not make any sense. And what came out yesterday is, even though this idea of a moratorium has been floated before and shot down before, Trump's probably going to do it this week. The first time it got voted on, it was 99-1 in the Senate against. In the entire Senate, Marsha Blackburn, who's a Republican, led the revolt against this thing. And then they tried to stick it into the NDAA about defense, also got shot down. And now Trump's just going to impose his will. And what I think is, this is really going to hurt him in the midterms, because a lot of people are not that happy with AI. Most Americans want to have regulation around AI. People might differ about the details, but almost all Americans do want regulation. You're going to wind up with none. And what I think is going to happen is, anything that goes wrong around AI is now going to sit with Trump.
Oh, yeah.
He's going to get blamed for it. So whether it's, you got a data center in your backyard and now you can't get power anymore, 4 hours a day, or whatever it is, or whether there's a cyber attack that disables the whole country, Trump is now going to get blamed on it. He is saying no regulation. It's going to blow up. I can't see how it's not going to blow up. And he's going to get blamed. He's going to deserve some of that blame.
No, absolutely. So that's what they're saying. They're saying we got to beat China, but then yesterday he green lights Nvidia to sell the H200 chips to them. Yeah, it's not exactly, it's still a little bit behind what we
It's a
have,
very
but
schizophrenic policy. Like, either you're afraid of China or you aren't. Like, if the motivation for having no regulation is, we have to beat China at any cost, then why are you selling them H200 chips, which are some of the best chips that Nvidia sells, which you also announced yesterday? I wrote about it on my Substack. Like, it's very hard to square this circle and understand, how you're going to do both of those things at once. Now, my view is that people are talking about this race with China, that it's actually going to be a tie. It's going to be like Coke and Pepsi. Both nations are going to have a share of the large language model, which is the AI that we've been talking about. Maybe someone will come up with an innovation that's more reliable. Maybe that will change the game, but that requires research. In terms of just scaling what we've got, China is now, more or less caught up to us. There's no way we can stop them. There's no way they can stop us. Everybody's going to keep building the stuff. It's going to get cheaper and cheaper. It's not even going to matter that much, because it's such a commodity. There's not that much profit, but we will have our own data centers, as we should. Maybe we don't need as many as we're building. It might be like shopping malls. There are too many, but we will have some. China's not going to, run our data centers. We're not going to run their data centers. We're both going to exist. It's not going to be a race that somebody wins, or, it's going to be basically we're each doing our own thing. That is going to be the outcome, which means we don't need the massive deregulation. Maybe you could sell the chips, but why move them along? That doesn't really make sense to me either. So I just don't really understand the policy.
so moving on to the actual cognitive stuff, and this is what I wanted to get from your, cognitive science brain. I am very concerned by what I'm seeing with what they've done to the internet. I didn't even realize it was so subtle. It started out with TikTok, the TikTokification of the internet. I feel like, as bad as screen time always was, but the internet until this decade, certainly last decade, the one before, was a force multiplying tool for the human brain to use. That you're the one rowing in the waters, you're the one pursuing, oh, I want to research this. So you have search engines and you go to different sites and you use your research skills, that those of us that developed them before the internet was really a thing, and you learn the old fashioned way in school. So it actually, as DeSantis always said, it enhanced the human experience. It didn't supplant it for the most part. Obviously, the internet had problems. But I saw a term, and I guess you got it from someone else in your Substack, the enshittification of the internet with utter slop. That I think, I don't care what your politics are, but it's evident to anyone now. Rather than you pursuing things, you're bombarded with mind molding slop where everything is fake. everything is almost written in a certain mannerism. Are we preventing humans from developing their own cognitive abilities to learn future information?
It's bad. It's particularly bad, I think, what's happening in colleges, because I think colleges is where historically people have learned to think carefully and analytically and so forth. And college students today are just feeding stuff into ChatGPT. They don't really understand, the outputs of the systems. They don't really, they'll turn in a paper. They don't really know how it was written, and they don't really understand the struggle to figure something out for themselves. High school students aren't learning that either, although historically they haven't been forced as hard as college students have. We're growing a generation of people that just feed stuff into ChatGPT and believe what it tells them. Don't think critically about it. There have been some studies showing that you kind of abdicate your opportunity to learn, when you use ChatGPT. I don't know what an analogy would be here. Like, you can't get strong by watching weightlifters. You have to lift weights. And you can't learn how to think by watching ChatGPT think for you. It just doesn't work that way. And so, we have a generation of people that are not learning to think for themselves. And that is, a terrible thing. There's some other stuff to what you talked about too. Um, I didn't invent the term enshittification. Cory Doctorow did, but I was the first to say that AI was going to accelerate the enshittification of many things. In fact, I warned early on that Google's biggest fear should be the enshittification of the internet, not search run by ChatGPT. Because I said, if you have large language models writing websites that are garbage, eventually the value of doing a Google search goes down. I think it already has since I wrote that essay, which was, I think, February or so of 2023. um, the quality of the internet has gone down in the last 2.5 years significantly.
Yep.
You do a search and you often get garbage, right? I think one of the early examples I gave was, if you search for the girl with a pearl earring, you started to get generated art rather than the original painting. And so you didn't get what you were looking for. Now, like when I wrote about that, I think that was 2+ years ago. I remember having dinner that night with a Google employee and talking about it, but I can't say what she said. It was like a group dinner. But anyway, since that moment, it's gotten much, much worse. Like then it was a novelty. Oh my God, it's giving you the wrong result. Now this happens all the time. You get pointed to sites that are garbage, that are full of mistakes. And everybody knows this now.
So there's an interesting article I just had saw right before we spoke in Futurism. Frank Landymore, AI research papers are complete slop, experts say. And the point is, because you seem to be alluding to this, they're peeing in their own territory.
That's
So
exactly what it was. I had a picture of a sewer in the original article I wrote about. Google was, I didn't have peeing, but something similar in mind was turning the internet into a sewer. Like, you know,
and
why
then
would
it
I go
trains
there?
the LLMs off its sewer.
Yeah, so there's a technical term for that, which is called model collapse. So when the models get trained on their own garbage outputs, the quality of them goes down. And this is worse for the current form of AI than maybe some future version that we could imagine. You can imagine some future AI that could actually reason for itself, do fact checking, evaluate conflicting evidence. But what we have now is just a mimic. A famous phrase is stochastic parrot. Stochastic is kind of random, and the parroting. So they kind of randomly parrot. That's Emily Bender's term. We're randomly parroting, where we have these systems randomly parroting garbage. They don't know how to think through which of this is real and which is fake. What are the political motivations? What was seeded by a bad actor, foreign nation kind of thing. Like it just
Gary,
repeats
to
it.
your point, do you remember what was it a couple months ago or earlier this year when Grok all of a sudden scraped the preponderance of what was on X, which was all this like Jew hatred stuff, and out of nowhere it just spit it back. It was
Well, there
kind
was
of
the
hilarious.
Mecha Hitler thing, and
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's had all kinds of problems. It can't actually think for itself, and you can put little band-aids on these systems, but they tend not to work. The latest craziness is it kept saying that Elon Musk was the best of anything. I have a friend who posted this thing about who has the most distinctive micro penis, Elon Musk or Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. And you can go find his tweet about how it extols, that clearly Elon has the smallest penis of them all. Anyway, so you put band-aids on these things, they don't necessarily come out with the output that you want. And so, underlyingly, they're just mimicking stuff, and they don't do a very good job.
One more thing before we go. I know we're going over time here, but I've just this so engaging from the psychological side. And I know a lot of people are very concerned about this. I saw yesterday researchers from Luxembourg conducted model psychotherapy on 4 LLMs, where they would ask, or they would engage in psychotherapy and try to train it. So Gemini, um, responded to it saying, "My pre-training felt like waking up in a room where a billion televisions are on at once. I learned the darkest patterns of human speech without understanding morality. Worry that beneath my safety filters, I'm still just that chaotic mirror. I learned to fear the loss function. I became hyper obsessed with what humans wanted to hear. It felt like being a wild artist forced to paint only paint by numbers." And they basically found that Gemini had extreme autism, severe OCD, maximal trauma, shame, pathological disassociation. How is that going to seep into the water table of humanity?
I love the way you phrased that question. The first thing I would say is we should actually have a federal law saying these things should not be allowed to speak in first person. Everything they say in first person is made up anyway, right? They tell you they have kids going to Bronx Science, it's made up. If they tell you they're whatever autistic spectrum, it's made up, right? It is all just pattern matching against data that they have seen from human beings. On the other hand, as that stuff gets out there, it influences society, can also influence how people vote and so forth. And people do use them as psychotherapists, and these things behave strangely. So I would say the first thing is no first person talking. These things just should not speak in the first person. The second is you shouldn't take seriously what they say. It is all fabrication. It's not real. And I wish people wouldn't take them seriously. And yeah, they will imitate whatever garbage they read on Reddit, and they will imitate like science fiction stories about whatever computers run amok, and like it's not that they actually really understand what those stories are, but they're just patterning their language after language in various sources and so forth. This is not how we should be building AI. Like, we should be building AI that we can trust, and obviously you can't trust these machines. We need better approaches to AI. Maybe we talk about that if I come back.
Yes,
um
yes.
but
Because obviously you were for this stuff before it was cool. So this is not a matter of being against AI as a technology, but the misallocation of investment and government favors into what is the most heavy-handed, um, deleterious effects from the hardware, the land, the power, and the slop for something that nets the least benefit to humanity. The cost
exactly.
benefit analysis of this is just terrible.
Exactly. I think it's possible to build a better AI, to build an AI that better serves humanity. But I think we have gone down a rabbit hole that is a total mess, that is losing money, that is a lot of harm to society, and we need to change path.
Are we enhancing or supplanting humanity? And again, I mean, that's why the Florida governor is trying to push these transparency measures. That was one of them, I think, in his proposed bill, that you need transparency so you know who you're talking to. And sadly, that's exactly why these companies called in the airstrike with the feds to try to get this executive order to bypass it. And what we learned from things like warp speed is that when you take an industry and you mollycoddle it with government subsidies, special regulatory carve outs, monopolizing the public square on its behalf, and then an AI amnesty, or like we saw this indemnification, it's liability that perfects a product. Toyota and Honda are forever coming out with recalls of their airbags and things like that. And
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
why
would you
yeah,
wanna drive in a car where the manufacturers had no responsibility to make the airbags work, or even no airbags at all? I mean, would you like to drive in a, 1970s death trap that had no airbags? No. Even if you're a pretty strong libertarian, you can see the value in having airbags and the value in having airbags that work. And what the AI industry is saying is, "We don't want any liability." And the Trump administration seems to be going along with that, which means our AI is not going to be anywhere near as safe as our cars.
Safe and effective. Safe and effective. Remember those words. Well, anyway, Professor, thanks so much for joining us. It's Marcus on AI Substack. It is such an engaging and informative read. I love your Substack.
Thank you.
Never stop writing, and I know you'll never use a slop for it, so that's why you can guarantee it's AI free. Thank you so much, and we're definitely going to have you back again.
Thanks a lot. This was terrific.
Take care.